My parents gave my siblings $200,000 and left me out, but later they came asking for help once I became successful. Hi, I'm Michael, and I'm 27. I guess you could say I've always been the one overlooked. I have two siblings, an older sister named Sarah and a younger brother named Chris, and to say they were the golden children would be an understatement. It seemed like they could never do wrong in my parents' eyes, while I was just there. Growing up, Sarah was the perfect student, straight A's, involved in every school activity, and then she got into a prestigious Ivy League school. My parents were ecstatic. From the moment she received her acceptance letter, they couldn't stop praising her. They even threw her a massive party, inviting all our friends and family. It was like a second Christmas, all in celebration of Sarah's academic achievements. Chris, on the other hand, didn't even need to put in much effort. Things just seemed to come easy for him. He followed Sarah's path and got into an elite graduate program. My parents made sure everything was set up for him, paying his tuition, helping him move, buying him a new laptop, you name it. And then there was me. I didn't get into an Ivy League school, I went to a state college. It was a good school, but I could tell it wasn't something my parents were going to boast about like they did for Sarah and Chris. When I told them I got accepted, they nodded and said something like, "That's great, Michael," but I could feel they weren't really excited. No party, no big congratulations. I was lucky if we ordered takeout that night. The older I got, the more obvious the differences became. It wasn't just about attention, it was also about money. Take Sarah's wedding, for example, $200,000, no exaggeration. My parents went all out with the venue, catering, and dress. They even flew in family from out of state. For Chris, they paid for his entire graduate degree and helped him with rent until he got settled. Even the youngest, Emily, didn't have to worry about student loans because they paid those off too. But when I started my career and needed tools to get going, I asked for help. They gave me $7,000. Now, don't get me wrong, $7,000 is a lot of money, but when you compare that to $200,000 for a wedding or paying off tuition, it stings. It felt like I was given the bare minimum, just so they could say they helped.
It wasn't just about the money. Every family gathering made me feel like the odd one out. At dinners, the conversation was always about Sarah's fancy job or Chris's latest accomplishment. They'd talk about their vacations, home upgrades, and expensive plans while I'd sit there, eating quietly, trying to think of something to add. But really, what could I say? Hey, I just finished a big project at work, and I'm still paying off my car. It seemed like my achievements didn't compare to theirs.
I remember one dinner in particular, maybe about a year ago. We were sitting around the table, and the conversation turned, as it always did, to Sarah's upcoming vacation. We're going to Europe for a few weeks. It's just so nice that Mom and Dad could help out with the expenses, she said casually, sipping her drink. Chris joined in, mentioning how their $200,000 helped with his wedding expenses. Emily was laughing about how tuition hikes didn't bother her, thanks to our parents. I just sat there, focusing on my plate, but their words were drilling into my mind. It wasn't just the money, it was that their futures had been handed to them on a silver platter, while I had to struggle and take out loans to make it. Every dollar was hard-earned for me, while they didn't have to worry. The worst part was that nobody even noticed I wasn't part of the conversation. I felt my frustration building. My face got hot, my hands clenched under the table, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I muttered, "Must be nice." The room went silent. All eyes were on me. Sarah was the first to speak, looking confused and annoyed. "What's that supposed to mean, Michael?" she asked, as if she couldn't understand why I was upset. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but it all came out in a rush. It means not all of us get everything handed to us on a silver platter. Some of us actually have to work for what we need. They still didn't get it. Chris shrugged, leaning back in his chair like it was nothing. "Michael, you're always playing the victim," he said with a smirk. "Didn't Mom and Dad help you with those tools for work?" That hit a nerve. Sure, they gave me $7,000, but compared to what they'd done for Sarah and Chris, it felt like crumbs.
Yes, they helped, but $7,000 compared to hundreds of thousands. It's not the same, and you know it. Mum, as usual, tried to make peace. "Michael, we thought that's what you needed. We've always aimed to give you what was fair. But how is $7,000 fair when you're handing out hundreds of thousands to everyone else?" My voice was laced with frustration as I replied. Fair? You think this is fair? You've handed them everything. You've practically paved their paths while I had to build mine, brick by brick. The discussion quickly escalated from there, with everyone trying to defend themselves, making it seem like I was overreacting. You're making this into a bigger deal than it is, Dad said, shaking his head. We gave you what you needed.
Needed? No, they gave me the bare minimum, and that's what hurt the most. They didn't care about what I wanted, only what they thought was enough to keep me quiet. I couldn't handle it anymore. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and left the room without another word. Their voices faded behind me as I walked out, but I didn't turn back. I was done being the forgotten one, the one who always got the leftovers. When I stormed out that night, I was livid. I don't think I've ever felt so angry. My heart was pounding in my chest like it was ready to burst, and each step I took down the driveway made the world seem like it was closing in on me. I had no idea where I was headed. I just knew I needed to get away, far away. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and the streets were eerily quiet, that kind of silence that makes everything feel a little too still. The only sound was my shoes hitting the pavement. I didn't pull out my phone or put in my headphones. I wasn't in the mood for distractions. I needed to think. As I walked, the memory of that dinner kept replaying in my mind: Chris's smug expression, Sarah's patronizing questions. It was like they were all living in this bubble of privilege and didn't realize how suffocating it was for me. They were wrapped up in their happy little world, and I was just on the outside, looking in. The more I thought about it, the more upset I became. I kept asking myself why I didn't say more, why I didn't really let them have it. But then it hit me: no matter what I said, it wouldn't have made a difference. It was like talking to a wall. They had their perspective, and I had mine, and those two things were never going to align. I ended up walking to a park I used to visit when I was younger. It wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute walk from the house. There was an old bench near the playground, hidden in the corner by some trees. It was one of those places you go to escape everything, and that's exactly what I needed. I sat down, leaning back against the cold wood, staring up at the sky. It was one of those clear nights where you could see all the stars. Normally I'd find it peaceful, but not that night. All I could think about was how unfair everything was, how I'd spent my entire life trying to measure up, only to be left with scraps while my siblings were given everything on a silver platter. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a moment I debated not looking at it. But curiosity won, and I pulled it out. Of course, it was a text from Emily. "Michael, where did you go? You need to come back. Let's talk about this." Talk? Yeah, right. I'd heard that before. Talking had never fixed anything in my family. It was always the same old routine: mom and dad explaining why things were the way they were, and me being expected to just accept it. But this time, I wasn't in the mood for more excuses. I didn't respond to the message, just shoved my phone back into my pocket. I wasn't ready to deal with Emily or anyone else right now. I needed space to think. As I sat there, I started going over everything in my mind: the years of being overlooked, the moments where I felt like an afterthought. I wasn't perfect, sure, but that didn't mean I deserved to be treated like I mattered less than the others. It wasn't even about the money. Not really. It was about being seen, being valued. And for some reason, my parents had decided that my dreams and needs weren't as important as Sarah's or Chris's. I kicked a small rock with my foot, watching it roll across the playground. I couldn't stay out there forever, even though the thought of never going back to that house was tempting. Eventually, I would have to figure out what to do, but for now, I just needed to be alone. I'm not sure how long I sat there, but after a while, the cold began to creep in. Fall was just around the corner, and the nights were getting chillier. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the wind cut through the thin fabric. I thought about heading home, but the idea of walking back into that house, facing them after everything that had happened, felt unbearable. My phone buzzed again, this time a call. Emily's name flashed across the screen. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether or not to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part thought maybe this time she'd actually understand. I hesitated a few seconds before finally swiping to pick up. "Michael, where are you?" Emily's voice was calm but carried that same hint of superiority that always grated on my nerves. "It doesn't matter," I replied, my voice flat. "I'm not coming back tonight." "Come on, you're being ridiculous. We're family. We need to talk this out," she said, as if it were that simple. Talk, I let out a bitter laugh. You mean like we always do, where I'm told I should be grateful for the little I get, and you all pat yourselves on the back for being such great siblings? That's not fair, she shot back. We didn't know you felt this way. How could you not know, I said, my frustration rising. Every time we sit down as a family, it's all about you, Sarah and Chris. You get the trips, the houses, the weddings, and I'm left with the leftovers. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't bother me. There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear her trying to think of something to say, something that would magically make it all better. But nothing came. Maybe we haven't seen things from your perspective, Emily finally said, her voice softer. But running off like this isn't going to solve anything. This isn't just about tonight, Emily, I said, rubbing my temples. It's about every time I've been left out, every time you guys got to live your best lives while I struggled to get by. I needed help, too, and all I got was a toolbox. She stayed silent for a while, and I could hear the faint sounds of life in the background, laughter, dishes clinking, as if nothing had happened, as if I didn't matter. Just come back, she eventually said. We'll figure it out, okay? But I wasn't ready to figure anything out. Not with them, not yet. I need time, I replied, before hanging up and shoving my phone back in my pocket. I leaned back on the bench, staring at the stars again. This wasn't something that could be fixed with just a talk. They didn't get it, and maybe they never would. But for tonight, I wasn't going to be the one pretending everything was fine. I barely slept that night. After leaving the park and getting back to my apartment, my mind was still spinning, and the weight of what had happened sat heavy on my chest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner over and over and over in my head. No matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't understand how things had gotten this bad. How could my own family be so blind to what I'd been dealing with for years? Sure, they were wrapped up in their own lives, but was it really that hard to see how unfair things had been? As the hours passed, I started thinking more deeply. Not just about the dinner, but everything that led up to it, all the times I'd been left out, all the moments I'd brushed off, telling myself they didn't matter. But they had mattered, and they had piled up over the years. This wasn't some one-off incident. It had been happening for as long as I could remember. And it wasn't just about the money, even though the financial imbalance hurt. It was more about how I'd been treated, how I was always the one left to fend for myself while they were taken care of. I was the one who had to figure everything out on my own. It wasn't even that I wanted their help. I just wanted them to acknowledge me, to see that my life mattered just as much as Sarah's and Chris's. Lying there in the darkness, I realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore. I was still frustrated, sure, but the intense rage from earlier had faded. What replaced it was a deep sense of exhaustion. I was just tired. Tired of fighting for a place in a family that had, long ago, decided I wasn't worth the same attention as my siblings. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, things felt a little clearer, not easier, just clearer. I knew that nothing would change unless I made it change. They weren't going to suddenly realize how unfair they'd been. It was up to me to make them see it. But the problem was, I didn't know where to start. A part of me wanted to cut ties completely and move on, but I knew that wasn't the solution. Despite everything, they were still my family. I didn't want to walk away from them entirely. I just wanted things to be different. I sat on the edge of my bed that morning, staring out the window at the empty street below. It was early, barely past 7 a.m., and everything was still and quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times I'd tried to bring up these issues before, how I'd hinted at the unfairness, only to be brushed off or told I was overreacting. But I wasn't overreacting. I just never had the opportunity to lay it all out for them.
That's when it hit me the only way they would understand was if I showed them, plainly and clearly. I needed to spell it out in a way they couldn't dismiss or argue with. Numbers don't lie, right? I wasn't sure if they'd listen, but at least they wouldn't be able to label me as dramatic or jealous, like they had so many times before.
I spent the rest of the morning digging through old files, emails, bank statements, anything that could help me make my point. I had receipts for the tools my parents helped me buy, but I also had proof of how much more they had done for Sarah and Chris over the years. I began organizing everything, putting it into neat piles that told the story I'd been trying to tell for years. It wasn't easy going through all those old documents. It was like reopening old wounds. I found emails where my parents had promised Sarah money for a down payment on her house. And then I found texts from Dad saying they couldn't help me with rent because they'd already given so much to Sarah that year. It stung. It really hurt. But it also fueled me. This wasn't just something I'd imagined. I had the proof right in front of me. As I worked, my phone buzzed a few more times, more texts from Emily, probably still trying to get me to come back and talk. I ignored them. I wasn't ready to talk yet. I needed to be fully prepared first, and I wasn't there yet. By the time I finished organizing everything, it was late afternoon, and I was mentally and emotionally drained. But now, I had something solid, something I could take to them and say, this is what I've been dealing with. This is why I'm upset. It felt like a strange kind of victory, though not a happy one. It was more like, okay, now they have to listen. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew they'd probably get defensive, especially Sarah. She always acted like she deserved everything she got. But I was ready for that now. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stack of papers in front of me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over something. I wasn't just letting things happen to me anymore. I was taking charge. Now, I just had to decide when and how I would confront them. I didn't want to do it over the phone or through texts. This needed to happen face to face. But the thought of sitting down with all of them again, after what happened at dinner, made my stomach churn. It was going to be incredibly awkward, but it had to be done.
I knew they were planning another family dinner soon, something for Emily's birthday. The timing wasn't ideal. Who wants to bring up this kind of thing at a birthday? But honestly, when is there ever a good time to have this conversation? There isn't, and I wasn't about to wait another year, hoping things would magically get better. That was it. I decided I'd confront them at Emily's birthday dinner. It wasn't going to be pleasant, and it certainly wouldn't be easy, but it was time to stop pretending everything was fine. I wasn't going to be the one left in the background anymore. When Emily's birthday dinner finally came, I was anxious. I had all my evidence prepared, every document, every detail that showed how my parents had favored Sarah and Chris over me. But knowing I was about to walk into a situation that would likely end in shouting made me uneasy. I wasn't trying to spoil Emily's birthday, but there would never be a perfect time for this conversation. It had to happen soon.
I arrived at my parents' house early, mostly to give myself a chance to settle my nerves. Everything looked normal, as if the disastrous family dinner a few nights ago had never taken place. Mom was busy in the kitchen, putting the final touches on the meal, and Dad was outside grilling like he usually did when the weather was nice. Emily was lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. She glanced up when she saw me and smiled. "Hey Michael, you good?" she asked, as if there wasn't any tension between us. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, though my voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. I wasn't fine. My heart was pounding, and the folder of documents under my arm felt like it was burning a hole through my clothes. I had to keep it together. Sarah and Chris arrived shortly after, laughing and chatting like nothing was wrong. It amazed me how easily they could brush everything aside, while I had been carrying the weight of this for years, and now it was about to all come out.
We sat down to eat, and for the first 20 minutes or so, it was the usual routine. Mum asked about my work, Sarah talked about her next vacation with her husband, and Chris joked about how wedding expenses were outrageous. Meanwhile, I barely touched my food, waiting for the right moment. And then, the opportunity came. After we finished eating and dessert was served, I set my fork down and cleared my throat.
"I need to talk to you all," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. Everyone looked up, surprised. Dad raised an eyebrow. "What's going on, Michael?" I took a deep breath and opened the folder, pulling out the first set of papers. I've been thinking a lot about what happened the other night, and I realized I've never laid it all out for you. I've carried this around for years, and now it's time you understand why I feel the way I do. Mom looked concerned, her eyes shifting to the folder. "Michael, can't we just enjoy the evening? It's Emily's birthday." I know I interrupted, not letting her guilt me into backing down. And I'm sorry, but there's never going to be a perfect time for this. I need you all to listen. I stood up, walked to the living room, and connected my laptop to the TV. Everyone watched as I navigated through my desktop, pulling up the presentation I had spent days preparing. It was simple, a slideshow of numbers, dates, and scans of the documents I'd collected. The first slide was straightforward, a chart comparing how much my parents had spent on each of us for education. Sarah's name topped the list, followed by Chris and then Emily. My name sat at the bottom with a shockingly low figure in comparison to the others. "What is this?" Chris asked, leaning forward on the couch. "This," I said, keeping my tone steady despite my shaking hands, "is what I've been dealing with. Here's how much you spent on Sarah's college tuition." I clicked to the next slide. "And here's how much you spent on Chris's graduate program. Here's Emily's everything, including her student loans." Covered, I paused, letting the numbers sink in. Sarah and Chris exchanged uncomfortable looks, but neither said anything. "And this," I continued, clicking to the final slide, "is what you gave me. $7,000 for tools. That's it. No help with tuition, no assistance for a down payment on a house, no wedding fund. Just $7,000. The room fell silent. I could see them processing the information, and the expressions on their faces told me they were finally getting it. Mom looked like she was about to cry, and Dad was frowning, clearly unhappy with where this conversation was heading. "Michael," Mom started, but I cut her off. "I'm not saying you didn't help me, but you can't sit there and tell me this is fair. Look at the difference. You gave them everything they needed to succeed, and I got the leftovers." Dad sighed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "We gave you what we thought you needed, Michael. You didn't ask for help with school." "I didn't ask because I knew you wouldn't offer," I shot back, my frustration building. "And I shouldn't have to beg to get the same support that Sarah and Chris received. You handed it to them without hesitation." Sarah, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke. "Michael, why are you bringing this up now? We never knew you felt this way." "Because every time I've tried to bring it up, you've brushed me off," I said, my voice rising. "Whenever I've hinted that maybe things aren't as fair as you think, you've told me I'm being dramatic or that I should be grateful for what I got. But this isn't about the money, it's about how you've made me feel like I don't matter as much as you." Emily looked down at her plate, visibly uncomfortable with where the conversation was going. "I didn't know it was this bad, Michael," she mumbled. "That's the point," I replied, shutting off the presentation. "None of you knew, because none of you ever bothered to notice. You were all too busy living your perfect lives while I was just trying to stay afloat." There was a long silence. Mom wiped away a tear, and Dad still had that stern look on his face, but no one argued. For the first time, it felt like they might actually be starting to understand. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said, breaking the tension. "I just wanted you to see what I've been dealing with. I needed you to understand why I feel the way I do." The room remained quiet, the tension thick in the air. No one knew what to say, and that was fine with me. I didn't need them to say anything. I just needed them to see. After my presentation, I could tell everyone was lost in their thoughts, unsure how to respond without making things worse. Honestly, I wasn't expecting an apology or some big resolution right then and there. But I had hoped for something, some acknowledgement, that what I'd been feeling wasn't just in my head. I sat back down, my heart still pounding. I could see my mom fiddling with her napkin, her eyes darting from one sibling to the next, trying to gauge what everyone was thinking. Dad hadn't said much since the presentation began, but I could tell he wasn't pleased. His arms were crossed, and his jaw was clenched like he was holding back from saying something. Classic Dad, bottling it up until he blew up later.
Sarah was the first to break the silence. "I didn't realize it was that bad," she said quietly, sounding more serious than I was used to. She didn't meet my eyes, just stared down at the remains of her cake, poking at it absent-mindedly. I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't realize? Come on, Sarah. This isn't new. I've been dropping hints for years, but every time I brought it up, it got dismissed." She glanced at me briefly before looking back at her plate. "I don't know, I guess." "I don't know," she muttered. It wasn't much of a response, but at least she was acknowledging something.
Chris, on the other hand, looked irritated, as if I had just ruined a perfectly good evening with my drama. "Michael, I get that you feel like you've been left out or whatever, but we all got what we needed," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, I worked hard too. Just because Mom and Dad helped me doesn't mean I didn't put in effort." That hit a nerve. Effort. Are you serious, Chris? "I'm not saying you didn't work hard, but you didn't have to struggle the way I did," I snapped. "You always had a safety net. Mom and Dad were there for you, making sure you had everything you needed, while I was scraping by, figuring things out on my own. It's not the same, and you know it. Chris just shrugged, still not understanding, or maybe not wanting to. It's not about effort, I continued, trying to control my voice. It's about the opportunities you were handed that I never got. You could focus on your dreams without worrying about rent or bills, while I had to hustle just to get by.
Emily, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. Michael, I'm sorry. I really didn't know you felt this way. I never even thought about the money, she admitted.
I sighed. That's the thing. None of you thought about it because it didn't affect you. It's easy to overlook something when it doesn't touch your life, she nodded, looking a bit guilty. And for a moment, I thought maybe she actually understood. Maybe they all did, at least a little. Dad cleared his throat, and we all turned to him. He'd been so quiet, I'd almost forgotten he was there. Michael, he began slowly, picking his words carefully, your mom and I never meant to make you feel like this. We thought we were doing what was best for all of you. I could feel the frustration bubbling up again, but I held it in, needing to hear him out. We gave Sarah and Chris what they needed for school because that's what they asked for. But you, on the other hand, you never really asked for much. You always seemed so independent, like you didn't want our help. I blinked, not sure if he was serious or if he just didn't get it. Dad, I didn't ask for help because every time I did, I was told there wasn't any money left or that you'd already done enough for me. What was the point in asking if I already knew the answer? At that point, Mom jumped in, her voice softer, almost pleading. Michael, we did what we thought was fair, based on what each of you needed at the time. Maybe we didn't realize the gap was so big, but we were trying to do our best.
I shook my head, rubbing my temples. It's not just about the money, Mum. It's about how I've felt like the odd one out my entire life. You were so focused on making sure Sarah and Chris were taken care of that you didn't even notice I was struggling. I wasn't asking for handouts. I just wanted to be seen.
The room fell into silence again, the weight of my words hanging in the air. I could see my parents processing what I had said, trying to figure out how to respond. Dad let out a long sigh, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Michael, we never wanted to make you feel like you didn't matter. We love you, you know that, right? I nodded, but it felt hollow. I know you love me, but love isn't just about words. It's about actions, and your actions made it pretty clear where your priorities were. Mom wiped at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling. We didn't mean to hurt you, Michael. We really didn't.
I felt my anger slowly fading, replaced by a dull ache in my chest. I hadn't wanted to hurt them either. I just wanted things to change. I wanted them to understand how much this had affected me. Whether they fully understood or not, I couldn't tell, but at least we were having the conversation that was something, right?
Sarah cleared her throat, breaking the silence. I think we need to figure out a way to make this right. It's not fair that Michael's been left out, and we can't just ignore that. Chris nodded, though he still didn't look thrilled about it. Yeah, maybe we can work something out.
Mum and Dad exchanged a glance, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like we were all on the same page, or at least heading in the right direction. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. This wasn't going to solve everything. Years of feeling like the forgotten one in my family wouldn't disappear overnight. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. After that family dinner, I told my parents and siblings I'd had enough. I was done being the afterthought, the one who always had to settle for less while they got more. I remember sitting there, telling them I planned on talking to the rest of the family about it. I wanted to hear what they thought because honestly I was curious if anyone else had noticed how I'd been treated. That's when my dad, of all people, turned to me with a cold expression and said, "Michael, you should just be happy with what you got."
He told me, if you don't like it, maybe you should leave. That hit me hard. I had always known where I stood with them, but hearing it said so bluntly felt like the final blow. So I did exactly what he said. I left. Not just that night, but for good. From that moment on, I decided to focus on myself. I had spent far too long seeking their approval, trying to make them see me as an equal. It wasn't worth it anymore. I threw myself into my work and concentrated on building the life I wanted, without them holding me back. I knew I had potential, and I wasn't going to let their lack of support keep me down any longer. At first, it wasn't easy. Walking away from your family isn't something you do without feeling guilt. But as I put distance between us, I began to see just how much energy I had wasted trying to win their approval. I shifted my focus to my career, working hard and putting in long hours. And you know what? It paid off. A few years went by and my life completely transformed. I wasn't just scraping by anymore, I was thriving. My work exceeded my expectations. I started small, just trying to stay afloat, but eventually I expanded my business to the point where I was hiring employees. I had a full team working under me, and the sense of accomplishment from knowing I built it all myself was something I had never experienced before. And it wasn't just about getting by, I was doing really well. The kind of success that made me look back at all those times I felt inadequate and laugh. I had clients coming from everywhere and formed connections I never imagined I would. In a strange way, walking away from my family had driven me to prove I could succeed without their help. But just as I was settling into this new chapter of my life, I got a call from my mom, which surprised me because we hadn't spoken much since I left. My phone buzzed and her name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but something made me answer. "Michael, we need to meet," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. There was something different in her tone, something desperate, not the usual guilt trip I had grown used to over the years. I hesitated. Meeting them wasn't something I really wanted to do, but curiosity got the better of me. After some back and forth, we agreed to meet at a cafe. When I arrived, they were already seated at a small table by the window. They looked different, tired, older. My dad, who had always had this confident, almost arrogant posture, was slouched in his chair, looking more worn out than I'd ever seen. Mom had dark circles under her eyes and kept fidgeting with her cup, which was unlike her. Something was definitely wrong. "Thanks for coming," Mom said as I sat down. I didn't respond, just nodded, waiting for them to get to the point. After a few awkward moments of silence, my dad finally spoke. "Your siblings. They've cut contact with us," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They don't talk to us anymore," my mom added, her voice shaky. "Sarah moved away with her husband, and she won't return our calls. Chris has distanced himself too. And Emily, we haven't heard from her in months." I sat there, trying to process what they were telling me. It was hard to believe. Sarah, Chris, and Emily had always been the golden children, the ones who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. Now they were the ones who had walked away. "We're struggling," Michael, my mom continued, her voice breaking. "Without them, we're really struggling financially, emotionally, everything." And there it was, the real reason they wanted to meet. They needed help. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a swirl of emotions inside me. Part of me thought this was some twisted version of karma. They had pushed me aside for years, ignored me when I needed them most, and now they were the ones coming to me for help. The irony wasn't lost on me. But strangely, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. I didn't sit there thinking, "This is what you deserve," instead. I just felt exhausted, tired of all the drama, the years of resentment, and the constant need to prove myself. "So what exactly do you want from me?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. "We were hoping you could help us out," my dad said, still avoiding eye contact. "We know things haven't been great between us, but we're in a tough spot, especially financially." Ah, the money. I should have seen it coming. I looked at both of them, wondering if they realized just how absurd this all was. The same parents who had once told me to be happy with what little I got were now asking me for help because their favored children had abandoned them. "I don't know," I said honestly. "You made it pretty clear a few years ago that I wasn't your priority, and now you're asking me for help because Sarah and Chris won't."
They exchanged a glance, and for the first time I saw something in their faces I hadn't seen before. Regret, real, genuine regret.
"We know we messed up," Michael, my mom said softly. "We should have treated you better. We didn't realize it until it was too late." I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive them, to be the bigger person. But another part of me, the part that had spent years feeling overlooked and undervalued, wasn't ready to let go of all that pain. "I'll think about it," I finally said, standing up to leave. "But I'm not making any promises." As I walked out of the cafe, I realized something important. I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore.